Good afternoon. Thank you guys for joining us for today's installment of the PENC webinar series. I'm Katie Cox. I will serve as moderator for today's presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box and I will try to assist. We will be taking questions at the end and you can type those into the questions box at any time. Your PDH forms and NCBEL survey will be emailed to you at the conclusion of today's presentation. Today's presenter is Dr. Ken Gall. Professor Gall is currently the Associate Dean of Entrepreneurship and Professor of Mechanical Engineering and Material Science at Duke University. His expertise is in the mechanical behavior of materials with emphasis on the creation, modification, understanding, and commercialization of synthetic biomaterials. His publications have been cited nearly 20,000 times with an H-index of 76. He is a founder and director of 6 active medical device startups. Professor Gall, thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, Katie, how you doing? Thank you for having me.
All right, I will turn it over to you for the presentation.
All right, great, thanks. Appreciate you all coming in here to listen. I'm gonna try to use the field of medicine and medical implants to teach you a little bit about 3D printing and kind of the material science and the mechanics. Just a small note, I'm a mechanical engineer by training, so I'm not a biomedical engineer. I don't really, I study cells or genes or these types of things. I'm really a mechanical engineer making parts to try to reconstruct the body. So it should be this is gonna be pretty mechanically oriented as we think about it. So just a real quick thing, couple disclosures. I am representing kind of Duke here, but as a professor, but I do have equity ownership in some of the startups that are we're gonna talk a little bit about the materials that are in here. And so I just disclosed those here, that I have obviously a financial conflict in some of that. So just a little bit about the type of research my group does. It's really a sort of an intersection of these 3 things. We look at new materials, how we might apply these in medicine, and then we often use unique processing methods like 3D printing. And we work sort of with my lab, we work with surgeons, we try other academic collaborators that have expertise I don't have, and then we work with industry. So worked with kind of all 4 of these working together and depending on the project, and I'll sort of highlight that. But the idea is to really innovate in the medical field. And I think there's some analogies to other types of fields that this can be applied to. If you look at just the field of 3D printing, this is a really busy slide, so I won't really go through every detail on here, but if you kind of look on the right, that's the type of printing that we have. And on the left is a big sort of eyesore chart that the FDA put out in 2015. And on the right, you see that that you can do a bunch of different things with printing in medicine. So a lot of people are doing medical models, using mostly polyjet, and I'll come back to these different techniques. You can make implants, which are by the way, medical models are just models of the anatomy to try to plan surgery. Implants, which are replacements for tissue or augments for tissue. Surgical tools like cutting guides. Those are other things. So you can really do instruments for surgery and also actual implants or models. And if you look at this thing on the left, the kind of the summary of that crazy eye chart is there's a lot of areas that dominate it. So for example, laser-based metal for implants, laser-based techniques dominate, and I'll talk about what those are in a second. Also, if you notice, if you look at implants, metals are mostly used for implants right now that are 3D printed. On the flip side, if you look at instruments and guides, it's more of a split. You'll see metals and polymers. And then you'll see there's all kinds of little breakdowns in sort of the areas that are used. And we'll talk about some of those today, but there's obviously one of the big areas is surgical guides, but then you have hip and knee and shoulder reconstruction, spine and whatnot. So been a very hot area in medicine the last decade. So since 2010 and even since this it's sort of ramped up. If you want to take a look at where 3D printed implants came specifically, and I'll talk mostly about implants today, a little bit about instruments. Started in around 2010. We're the first, this is an acetabular cup, and that is a part of a hip replacement. The acetabular cup is something that goes into kind of your acetabulum right there by your pelvis, and then your femur attaches to that. And that was one of the early 3D printed implants. Then they started doing patient-specific cranial plates, 2013. There's some bunion plates, 2014. A lumbar fusion cage is one of the first used in spinal surgery, and now this is almost the gold standard in spine surgery fusion, which is 3D printed, and so on. And so these kind of grew over the last 10 years. And these are just examples of implants that came in, but it's been a real change in the last decade from kind of traditionally manufactured implants to ones that are made with 3D printing. And there's really two reasons for that in medicine. So as we look through this, you'll kind of see these resonating throughout. One is you can build complex porous structures that attach to the natural tissues better. And that's probably one of the main reasons. The second is you can match the anatomy and do much more patient specific. So everyone's body is different, and so you often want to be able to print to the patient's anatomy. If you also look at just one other thing about this in medicine, 510K clearance is kind of the clearance that you use to approve a medical device, and it's just like other standards you'd see in other fields, in other mechanical and civil-based fields. This is something we use to actually, we rely on a lot of ASTM standards, for example, in these 510K submissions. But if you look at the 510K before 2000, there was only a couple. So like I said, there was very little. And there's a couple people starting to look at patient-specific devices in 2000, 2010. But what you notice is that the number of patient-specific clearances that the FDA has gone after in the last 20 years is really amplified by the fact that printing came on board. And so once 3D printing made this an economical way to make implants patient-specific, the number of submissions to the FDA and clearances is really gone up by a factor of 20. And it's all gone up even more the last couple of years. So just to talk quickly about the types of 3D printing, and this is just sort of give you a little idea of what they are. And in this presentation, we'll have a bunch of, I'll show you some different examples of things. Some of it will make sense, some won't, but open to questions at the end. So again, we talk about medical models, implants, and surgical instruments. There's a couple different printing methods. One is called material polyjetting. You can think of this as basically a printer that comes in and builds a three-dimensional part by ejecting very small droplets of a curable resin. And so it's not different. It's not that different actually from inkjet printing on a piece of paper, where you inkjet these droplets to create this printed page. You just do this in 3 dimensions and you build this up a 3-dimensional. The materials from that are very weak, but they're very colorful and very high resolution and have lots of different textures. And so they're very good for models. They're not as good for something that has to bear a lot of structural load. Then there's powder bed fusion. That's where you start from a powder and use a laser to either sinter the particles or melt the particles into a 3-dimensional object layer by layer. And that's powder bed fusion. That's mostly in metals, but also using polymers. Material extrusion is the probably most common type of printer people see, because these are the hobbyist printers are material extrusion. These are basically, you can think of like a hot glue gun that lays down layer by layer different lines, and then you build a 3-dimensional object. This would be like the really low cost, couple $100 printers. And then the last is vat photopolymerization that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit today. Vat photopolymerization is sort of a, you start with a vat of liquid and you either build the part from the top or build it by pulling it down. And that's, you're going from a resin. So the easiest way to think about this for the implants is you either start with powder and make a 3-dimensional part, you start with filament to make a 3-dimensional part, or you start with a resin to make a 3-dimensional part. And obviously the only one we use metal is powder bed fusion. And then there's a couple others on the right I won't talk about. So, one broad question that comes up, and especially in, not just in medicine, but in other fields, is what can we print? What are the things? And we can actually print a pretty broad range of materials. So we can print these are all printed materials. There's a relatively soft elastomer, a little bit more rigid elastomer, getting into harder materials like polyether ketone, that's PEEK. This is polysulfone. So even a little more rigid. Then you start getting into the metals. Here's titanium, and then back to the original. So, if you think of this, it allows us to start looking at, and you can see the human body here, applications all over the body, because we can print a huge range of stiffnesses. And those stiffnesses kind of cover a really wide range of parts. Now, one of the things that, and if you look on the bottom, you can kind of see the softest being like breast tissue and the hardest being bone. And we can actually make polymers, in that almost entire range with 3D printing. We can also print all kinds of different porous structures. So if you look on the bottom right, those are the vast array of structures you can print that are three-dimensional and porous. And in biomedical applications, this is very critical. This has other applications in engineering. Obviously, if you're trying to lightweight a structure or give it some type of fluid flow or some type of heat flow capacity, you might want to think about how to make it lighter. It does alter other properties like the fatigue performance, of course. We like it because it allows tissue to ingrow. One thing we noticed a long time ago is that if you plot the compressive strength of all of these different materials, all these different scaffolds, as a function of the compressive stiffness, it doesn't work perfectly, but there's kind of a master curve, meaning we can make the materials much more porous and lower modulus, but you also get a drop in strength, right? So that's the way to think about it from an engineering standpoint, is you don't get a free lunch there. So if you want it to be much less stiff and really more porous and things like this, then you also lose strength. So I'm gonna just go over a couple different examples, and we'll start with metals and what kind of stuff we do in metals. So here, and I'm gonna pose these all kind of the same way because it just gives you some ideas, and I'll talk a little bit about the engineering and the science. For example, one of the things we go after is something called flat foot. This is a deformity where the foot is flat rather than curved. It's a relatively common procedure. You have to have an osteotomy to do that. What happens is they make a cut in one of your bones, and they have to put a wedge in there to kind of open your foot up and actually give it the angle back. And we've sort of been working on these osteotomy wedges produced by that LPBF is laser powder bed fusion. And what they allow us to do is make very, very complex porous topologies that bone can grow through, and they allow the surgeon to choose designs based on the patient's anatomy. And I'm gonna, after I go over a couple of these examples, I'm gonna show you a little bit about laser bed powder fusion and some data. The other place that this is very common is spinal fusion. So if you have heard of spinal fusion, this is when one of your disc degenerates. And if your disc degenerates bad enough, it squishes, the two vertebrae come together, the disc pushes on your spinal cord, that causes pain in either your arms or your legs, and really becomes debilitating eventually to the point where you need that disc out. And you don't want to just take the disc out and let the vertebrae fuse, because then you lose, a half an inch to an inch every time you do that, and your height and your lordosis is messed up. So what surgeons do is they cut that disc out and they place a titanium 3D printed scaffold between your two vertebrae. And that scaffold promotes the vertebrae to attach themselves. So you lose that range of motion, but the good news is you lose all the pain that you had. And so it's a similar type of problem. And what's really fascinating about this problem is you need a really, really high strength structure that's porous that also will allow you to have bone growth through it. Because if the bone doesn't go through it, you don't really fully get to fuse those together, and there's a chance that it will break eventually. So that's why printing is used so often in spine, because you have this nice high strength porous scaffold that bone can grow through. Looking at some bigger, situations, this is orthopedic oncology. So this is a case where if you have a tumor in your, kind of a large bone defect tumor, unfortunately quite common, more common in some young adults. Even this, I think this is an actual case from someone that was 19 years old. And what happens there is if you cut out that tumor, you lose your entire acetabulum, that whole part of your, essentially of your pelvis, and you need to replace it. And we can now replace that pelvis with a replica of the other side. And that other side replica will then integrate to your pelvis on the spot. We put porosity in there to do that. The alternative to this is called a flail reconstruction, where you really just don't have the mechanics of the hip connected. And it was obviously a terrible situation for someone who's young and active and wants to keep moving. And So these are relatively new. This is a new area, where printing is enabled to make these kind of customized parts that can really osseointegrate with the rest of the bone. And these are much more rare than the other ones. Last one, I think I have two more, then I'll show you a little bit about printing. There's another, if this is kind of a trauma accident, so if you have a large bone defect due to trauma, so this is for example, this patient came in and their car was hit by another car on the side, and this crushed their knee. This crushed their femur above the knee only, and their knee joint was 100% intact, which is pretty crazy. So we're able to create a really long defect, a really long structure to replace the fractured bone, because all the bone died. So as soon as the patient was, it was just a couple days and the bone just didn't make it. So we replaced all of the femur with this 3D printed scaffold, and we're able to interface that very directly with the working knee. And you can see that in the far right here. So there's the implant, and this is the knee joint here. You can see that's where the cartilage is. And so that allowed us to really come in and give an anatomic fit to this person who lost that large amount of bone. There's other alternatives for this type of surgery. A lot of them fail. You try to put, with that much bone loss, you got to put foreign bone in, and sometimes if that doesn't work, that's called an allograft. If the allograft dies, then you have to keep having surgery till your body accepts it. This is a little too big for autograft. There's some other types of, that's bone from your own body. There wasn't a lot of really good alternatives before we could make these really large porous structures that could both hold enough load to keep the bone active and also be able to take bone and grow it across that defect. The last one, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit of the engineering of some of these things, is there's a problem called talar vascular necrosis. And that's when the bone between your tibia and your calcaneus dies. It's a really tough situation. It's a really hard disease, because essentially if that bone dies, then your tibia starts to rub, just basically crushes that bone because it's gone, and then rubs directly onto your calcaneus, and it's almost like instant arthritis, like super arthritis, right? So it's not even just like a little bit of cartilage gone, it's just that bone is missing. And so the two bones don't even join, and that often leads to amputation. And so, this isn't a super common problem, but this is, there are thousands of patients a year that have this. And so we've found ways to actually reprint that entire bone out of cobalt chrome and give patients a chance to, last. And the farthest one of these is like 7 years out. And so this is giving them a chance to actually prolong that and keep looking at ways to keep their leg, even if they've had this talar AVN. And this, again, allows us to print something that's shaped just like the anatomy of the native talus that died, but also ways of having porosity to attach it to the bone where it's not going to have load bearing, where it's not going to have contact. And so you do have, for example, contact. This is actually a total joint on the top half of that. So these are just a couple little examples. I want to just talk through some of the engineering of some of these things, what we've studied. And one of the hard decisions you make when you're making a 3D printed object in metal is what type of porous structure do you print? And so there's so many different structures. So if you're a civil engineer, the truss, this is a kind of a mainstay of civil structures and elements. And if you kind of dig back to the history of trusses, one thing that makes them advantageous is you can assemble them and do things, and they transport well. And there's other aspects that are good about trusses. We've sort of found that a truss is a good structure, but it's not the highest strength structure when you start opening up the world of what you can print. So we've been studying these strut-based structures, different types of trusses, what's called a skeletal TPMS, which is a triply periodic minimal surface, and then also sheet-based TPMSs, which are these structures that have these three-dimensional sheet structures that are periodic in all directions. And we found that if we sort of, as a function of scaffold porosity, if we vary scaffold porosity, the first thing you notice is if you make it more porous, it's a lot weaker, right? So if you have 50% porosity, you've got reasonable strength, and you're going to drop your strength by a factor of 10 when you get to 90% porosity, which is really, really porous. But the other thing, minus a couple outliers, we started noticing is that these sheet-based structures for the same porosity have a lot better compressive strength. And that's a lot of implants in the body rely on the compressive strength of these. And, we've really started to try to understand a lot of that effect and why that is. And, what it kind of comes down to, the easiest way to think about it is, the problem with the truss-based structures is they can undergo local buckling, and there's other little mechanisms that allow them to fracture or fail easier. The sheets are really, really hard to buckle because they're kind of in this long interconnected path, and they're almost kind of pre-buckled, if that makes sense. And so the sheet-based structures tend to be much, much stronger for the same porosity. And so they also have much higher permeability of fluids and other things in the heat and bone. So we've sort of moved a lot towards these sheet-based structures. These were not structures that were possible to make before 3D printing. We've also done a whole bunch of work trying to understand sample size. So if you are an engineer, you work in standards and these types of things, we find that the sample you test has a big impact on what you're looking at. And this is data showing that if you plot the strength of a sample as a function of what we call D over U, where D is the size of the sample, the diameter of the test sample, and U is a measure of the periodicity, right? So if you have a very large D over U, you've got lots of little unit cells inside your sample. If you have a very small D over U, you don't have very many unit cells, right? It only repeats itself like once or twice. And what we found is, not surprisingly, it's probably intuitive, is at very low D over U numbers, the strength drops, right? So you have to have a certain number of repeats in your sample. And this has implications in terms of designing things, like if you're going to design something for a certain size, especially in the body, your sample can only be so big. You need to have unit cell sizes that are small enough to have enough of them to have the right strength. Now, we also found that the gyroid was least sensitive to this effect. So if you look at the strut and the octet, it ended up having strength values that dropped even farther than the gyroid. And that should make sense. When you cut the edges of a truss, you sometimes cut the nodes off. So if you have a circular pattern and you cut it in a circle, you cut nodes and things off, and those nodes help load bearing, as you'd expect, right? So if you have these sort of free hanging struts on the ends, you lose strength quickly if you start having a lot of area consumed by that. We've done a lot of work in sort of understanding how the printer itself can lead to processing optimization. So this is a laser-based method. So you come in with a really high-powered laser and hit the powder and melt it in a very local region. And what we found is, I'll play this video, it's kind of cool. This is a nano CT computed tomography of a porous structure that's printed. And all those little pores in there, what we found is that the parameters that the manufacturer gave us were terrible. And so essentially we ended up in a situation where all these structures, and you can kind of see the powder there, but all these structures had a bunch of pores that we didn't plan on having within the walls. And so we ended up having to play around with the parameters of the laser and understanding how we use laser and scan speed and the dwell time to really print more of a solid structure. And that's what this is on the right. And those structures that are more solid like this, so there's pores where you want pores, and then it's missing pores where you don't want pores. Gives you much better fatigue response. This is just a fatigue curve. And so we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make sure our materials have the optimal fatigue response to give enough time for the bone to grow. So there's a lot of examples of why you might care about good fatigue response. It's probably obvious to a bunch of civil and mechanical engineers for sure. But if you have porous architectures, they are going to fatigue at some point. There was a big recall of striker printed cages because of fatigue and fracture. And you have a lot of spots for stress concentrations and crack nucleation. So your fatigue limits in these materials are much lower than solid materials. And so we spent a lot of time kind of understanding, all right, how do we heat treat these materials to optimize that fatigue response? Should we use hipping, which is hot isostatic pressing? What type of heat treatments should we do? And these are just images of, how we heat treat and what type of grain structures we build as a function of heat treatment. This is a example of fatigue resistance. And so just this plot on the upper left is just a stress life curve. And it's a stress max as a function of the strength. So it's normalized. And what you notice, if you think of classical mechanical engineering, you get your fatigue life is usually about 50% of your ultimate tensile strength. And in the best case scenario, which would be this top curve, we get about 50% strength, fatigue strength. And I wouldn't call this a run out. Obviously, there's not a plateau like you'd see classically in fatigue, but we do, in the worst case scenario, you get like 10%. So there's a big drop in fatigue properties, even relative to the strength of its scaffold you have to be careful with. So you're introducing all kinds of defects and all kinds of things. So you get all these great properties out, but then you've got to really design your structure to accommodate fatigue in the way you want. And we've also found that the gyroid sheet structure in compression has much better fatigue properties than the strut based. And that's by about a factor of 3 or 4. So it's a pretty big difference. We do a lot of work where we try to test, we do some animal models where we try to understand how bone grows into, and we're mechanical engineers, so we do tests where we look at how the bone grows into these printed scaffolds, and then we sacrifice the animals and then do torsion tests and things on the sacrificed bones to really understand how well does bone attach to these and how strong can you get bone. And we've found that you can actually get as strong or stronger than the native bone because you now have a hybrid of a titanium piece in there plus living bone, and that will give you better strength than you started with. Done also a couple sheet models trying to understand how porous should we have the sample. If you look at porosity of these samples, if they're 50% porous, they're much stronger than if they're 90, but the osseointegration strength is actually optimized somewhere in the middle. So we've kind of discovered that the best porous structure is kind of in the middle, about 60, 70%. It gives you the maximum osseointegration attachment strength, but also gives you reasonable mechanical strength and fatigue properties. Let's skip that for right now. We've done a bunch of work too on cobalt chrome. So this is just switching alloys. I forgot to mention those were all titanium alloys that we were looking at in the first one. But what we found with cobalt chrome is used in the body mainly because articulating surfaces. So you can actually polish them, highly polished, to articulate with other joints or in hemi-arthroplasty or articulate with other metals in full arthroplasty. And the cobalt chrome actually, and we don't understand why, cobalt chrome prints really, really well. So it prints much better than the titanium. We think some of that's just the sensitivity of the titanium to little small amounts of oxygen. But we can get really strong fatigue properties of the cobalt chrome, in some cases normalized compared to its strength a couple times higher than titanium. And so where titanium takes a pretty big hit in fatigue properties, cobalt chrome is actually pretty close to the raw material. In fact, it's in the 50 to 80% range of the yield strength, which is really high for fatigue strength. So I'll make just a switch here and just trying to show you a breadth of type of things we work on. That was metals. We actually do work on photopolymers for instruments and implants. And so these are two examples. This is a device that releases antibiotics. So if you have an infection in a total joint, you have to replace it with this. And then this is just this white thing here is just a device that delivers an implant. It's called an inserter. So nothing too fancy, but we make those out of plastic. So a lot of the things we're concerned with in these are, you need to be able to see the plastics on X-ray. So we have to dope them with barium sulfate. And that also has an impact on the strength. So we do these types of studies, and these are just images of the plastic doped with different amounts of barium sulfate from the printer. We dope the resin directly and then 3D print it. You can see that with 0%, you don't see much, especially if you had bone in the background, you wouldn't be able to tell where it was. And as you get up to a couple percent, you get a nice effect of blocking the X-rays. Of course, that comes with the downside. So if you plot radiopacity, that increases. But as you dope the material with something that's higher strength, with something that makes it more radiopaque, you start to lose toughness. So the material becomes more brittle. And you lose some of the properties that you care about, impact, because a lot of these instruments are malleted on during the procedure. So one of the things we've done from a more of a business standpoint is we've started to look at there's a lot of these current reusable instrument trays that require all kinds of different sterilization. There's a lot of infection potential or cross-contamination of these trays from patient to patient. And so we've been sort of using these super low cost, high strength printed devices to take care of some of the infection problem or some of the cross-contamination, and just provide these kind of single use type of instruments that are low cost and fit to the patient. Been also studying the release of drugs from these 3D printed scaffolds. So one of the nice things is when you use photolithography, it's a low temperature process, so drugs can survive this process, and you can actually dope some of these things with drugs that you might need coming out of your implant. And so without going over the details, this is a way we've sort of compared how it is to have like PMMA, which is what it's just acrylic, which is something people use now in bone cement to release drugs, how we can then create reservoirs and create 3D printed structures that can release drugs really, really exquisitely in terms of the time frame you need. So whereas calcium sulfate just dumps all the drug, you can see that in the lower right here, this is the release as a function of time. PMMA barely releases anything, then stops. We can kind of with these really nice curves and release drugs exactly at the rate we want from these kind of printed reservoirs that have complex channels. This is a pretty simple example, but we build channels into the devices to let the drugs get out. That's sort of what this is. That's, looking at how do we build a reservoir inside this. These holes are not the reservoir, but the reservoir is inside here. That reservoir allows you to release the drug in this kind of total knee if you have a joint infection. I'm going to lastly talk about kind of these softer 3D printed thermoplastics. This is FDM. So I went over, the first was laser sintering metals. Second was photo cured kind of photopolymers from a resin bath. And then the last these are fused deposition modeling. So this is FDM, or the sort of robotic hot glue gun. And so we were looking for a long time at these sort of airway stents. And so this is if you have a airway obstruction due to cancer or some other situation, that the silicone stents off the shelf don't fit well. They put all kinds of, they're not shaped like your airway. No one's airway is shaped exactly like a Y or a straight like this. It's more like this. So what airway really looks like, that's a CT scan of a real airway. I'm sorry, an MRI. And so we're able to reproduce three-dimensional stents that actually could be placed right into that airway and then change migration. And these were produced by fused deposition modeling. We do a lot of studies in that, trying to understand, all right, when you do fused deposition modeling, how much porosity do you get? You're not trying to get porosity here. And so these are examples of something, and a small amount of porosity can actually have a big impact on how it looks and what it does. So that's just a couple percent porosity in B, and you see you actually end up having a lot of pores that can have a big impact on the strength. And then we also look at trying to understand the fatigue properties of fused, this is FDM versus injection molded. So just like the metals where we use wrought metals to compare, injection molding is kind of our gold standard, right? So we print parts and then we try to understand how do the printed parts, how does the fatigue response compare to injection molded parts? And we found that we can get pretty close under the right conditions to injection molded strengths. I have a big project with a UPMC hospital and pelvic organ prolapse. So this is a topic, it's a really serious clinical problem with prolapse of the organs in women. And right now, the polypropylene meshes have been a bunch of litigations around these. They came from the hernia mesh space. They're very rough. And so we've been working on kind of printing these three-dimensional scaffolds that are much more elastomeric that could potentially work in prolapse. And so those are just sort of in the benchtop sort of animal phase right now. But the idea is to make something that can hold the organs, but not be so rigid like a hernia mesh. And so that's an example where FDM can print sort of in plane, very different structures you want. It's like not even really like a mesh at that point, it's more like a membrane. So we, in those type of studies, obviously in those materials, we're early stage, but you can look, this is just a comparison of force. This is a mesh test. So you usually test meshes in force per width, function of strain. And this is what the current meshes look like. So they're very stiff and then they break. But these polycarbonate urethane meshes can stretch huge amounts and then bounce back and have much lower stiffness in this low range. And so we're working on trying to figure out if this added low stiffness will create less complications in these types of meshes, because the rigid ones had a lot of complications. There's a bunch of lawsuits and things that happen with these. We also I collaborate a bunch, not just on animal models, we do a lot of cell models and try to understand how cells behave in these types of 3D printed structures. So these are just cell studies looking at how the cells behave in these materials. I have a project looking, this is in the oncology space, so in kind of this breast reconstruction and marker. So if you have if it's instead of a mastectomy, have a lumpectomy where you remove just a part. Right now they use a biosorbable marker called a Biosorb. It's a hard plastic marker with these metal, kind of metal markers. So, and that's used for radiation treatment of the lumpectomy site. The problem is it's not matched to the site's geometry, nor is it soft. And so it's pretty palpable under the skin. And so we've been working on trying to look at the creation of a more patient-specific, much softer marker, so we can still mark the site and see the site, but we can actually, it won't be so palpable underneath the skin. And that's a little bit of the data that we've been kind of working on and trying to understand how they look. Unfortunately, this is an example of research. The first parts we made that we actually sent in to the mammogram to be looked at, and we're using them in a kind of dummy thing, looked like cancer. So it was actually almost the worst case scenario. So we've been working hard to try to make, we don't want an image that looks like that. So that's something that gives you an example of how you make a material that fits all the needs you have, and then there's some other need that obviously unacceptable for how it looks, for example, or how it images. So this is kind of last thing. We do work also in biodegradable printable materials. That's a very small subset. I don't know if any of you work in any industries where you use biodegradable polymers, but it's much harder to get a biodegradable printable material. There's a bunch of polylactic acids you can print, but they just have absolutely terrible properties. So I've been working with the chemists at Duke to try to figure out how to print biodegradable polymers, and making some pretty good progress there, and new systems that we can actually 3D print the structure and then allow it to degrade away. That's it. So I probably saved a good amount of time for questions. I kind of went through that quick, but I think I'd prefer to do it that way and open discussion if we wanted to have it.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, go ahead and type it into either the chat box or the questions box. We have one. Can you talk about any issues with the compatibility of the 3D printed metals with the body?
Yeah, sure. Can I kill this thing now, or what am my screen's still showing, right?
Your screen is still showing. Yeah, you moved your slides down.
Yeah, I'll bring that back up if we all need it.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a good question. So as far as compatibility, it's really the same. The metals are the exact same alloy as the normal materials. The only difference is there's a slight difference in oxygen. So as long as they have the mechanical properties from a biological standpoint, it's exactly the same as the metals that are already in the body. So we're 3D printing Ti6Al4V and also cobalt chrome, which are already in the body. There are people trying to print some materials that are not in the body. That's a new biocompatibility issue then. But there's a lot of, the FDA is really tracking carefully the mechanical properties and the variability. And so you have other issues in terms of qualification, which are the body's reaction is fine, but you don't want the parts fatiguing or breaking. That's a lot more the FDA's concern right now.
All right, there's a question about your research group. What's the breakdown of the undergraduate degrees of people in your research group?
Yeah, great question. So I have a pretty strong mix. So my most common is mechanical engineering. So I get the most number of mechanical engineers. Probably that's going to be like, hopefully my percentages will add up here, 70% or something. And then I probably under that get a similar number of material scientists and biomedical engineers. So probably 10% material scientists, 10% biomedical engineers. And then I would call the remaining 10% other. And I have had every background possible in that other group. So I had a computer scientist who said he was tired of computer science and wanted to become a material scientist. I've not seen that transition often, but that was one. I just hired a biochemist. She came from a good biochemistry group. So she's a biochemist that's going to learn, printing and materials. I've had 2 chemists, just straight up chemists, and a physicist. So I've really seen most of them. I have had a civil engineer, kind of in that other, but it's mostly mechanical and is the predominant.
All right, next question. Why not print soft material for spinal disc replacement instead of rigid fusion aid for bones in the spine?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me first say that, fusion is still kind of the gold standard for spinal surgery, just because a lot of the replacements end up fusing. So people have tried some disc replacement things and they end up fusing. Having said that, discs the last 10 years have made a lot of progress, right? So they for a long time were really only available in Europe. They're now coming back, and there's some soft material discs. Well, they started with articulating surfaces, right? They started with things that were like joints, which is not how your spinal disc works, but they then have moved into softer discs. There's not a printed material strong enough, I think, for the disc yet. I think that the disc is a pretty tough environment, and so we need to improve the strength a little to get there. But we do have some projects working on that exact topic, so I think you're on the right track.
Okay, any other questions? I'll give everyone a few more minutes in case you're typing. I don't see anything else. I think that's all the questions for now.
No problem at all. I always leave enough time for questions. I think it's worse if people are like, when is this guy going to stop talking? So,
we did get one more.
Yeah, we can give everyone a minute or two. It's no problem. We have some time.
Okay. How long does it typically take to get FDA approval?
It varies. So if you're doing it with a 510K process, that's where you have a predicate device. So you have some device that looks kind of similar to your device, and you're going to make something that's close to it. That process is a couple years. If it's a pre-market approval, which means you're going to make claims about a new device that there's nothing like it on the market, that's 5 to 7 to 10 years. So it's a lot longer. And if you have a really, really new material that looks very high risk, and you put that very, very new material into a very common low risk application, you still could probably get it, shorter, maybe with a small clinical study. But if you have a high risk material, high risk application, you're 10 years plus. It's long. So it's unfortunately ranges from year. I've seen clearances in a year. That's the fastest we've done one, to 15 years. So you can be signing up for a pretty long one, some of them.
The question that we had earlier about compatibility, he clarified he was more interested in the chemical compatibility of the metals inside the body.
Yeah, so that's been a topic, there's a lot of discussion about that coming out of the metal on metal hips. There was a big recall because metal on metal hips. And what I think we learned in metal on metal hips, and this is just broad metal compatibility, we learned there is that if you have 2 metals that are rubbing against each other and you're letting off really, really small particles, and those particles can easily let out ions and things, there can be issues with metals in the body. And so we've really moved away from anything that has metal contacting metal in that type of application, the metal on metal. Other than that, if the metals have a nice oxide and they're well treated and they're not put in a situation where they're going to wear easily, then there's the compatibility, I think long term has been really, really good, even in like hemiarthroplasties where the cartilage rubs on the metal. But if you have metal rubbing on metal, that's been the only historically bad part. And, you know, the 3D printed metals are the same chemistry. So I think from a chemical standpoint, I mean, they are identical specification. The only difference is small amount of oxygen, which is not an issue from biocompatibility, because the biocompatibility of the titanium dioxide is pretty high, right? I mean, you don't ingest it necessarily always, but it's in you know, sun cream and all these other things. It's a pretty commonly used metal oxide, and that's mostly what the body sees, is the surface layer of that titanium dioxide.
Okay. Are these parts 3D printed during the surgery at the hospital, or are they printed separately offline and pre-tested before surgery?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, there's different implants, so nothing is printed at the hospital yet, except for in dentistry. So there's some of these things. If you've been to your dentist, they do print some things at the dental office. I don't know if they're quick enough to get while you're there. Sometimes it's like the next day. It depends on the setup. The parts are printed. There's a couple of hospitals like HSS in New York has a printer, a metal printer, but most everybody else, it's printed off site, and then is treated. And you really can't test the implant. You can do analysis of it like CT or to check that there's no voids, but you're relying on analysis, but also you can print duplicates and test those. So, and you do, one thing that's interesting about printing is when you print the parts, you print all kinds of test coupons around the part to make sure there's not some problem with the printing that's would impact also. You're always, every time you print something for an implant, you test those.
What would you say is the most insightful discovery you've seen with respect to drug, et cetera, diffusion research from the microstructures?
You know, from print, I'm assuming they mean just kind of drug elution from printed structures, is what I think they're asking.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I think the ability to control the drug release rate so exquisitely. So, like in most drug release things that are not 3D printed, or you don't have these controlled structures, you're sort of stuck with certain release rates, and you can kind of control them within, you know, reasonable amounts. But we can make the antibiotic release all in a day or last 50 days, and at a really controlled release. And that type of control is really hard to do with a chemical type of biodegradable release. So this is more of a physical mechanism that's blocking it from getting through. So it's really the controllability over long time periods. It's pretty amazing. This is the thing I've seen.
Do you use MRIs to get the exact dimensions, shapes, et cetera, of the thing to be replicated, and then let the 3D printer duplicate it?
Yeah, great question also. So usually in most orthopedic things, you're getting a CT scan first, except for spine, where you're trying to look at the disc. You're starting with an MRI. So we use both MRI and CT scan. If you just take those, the first problem is you have to threshold them. So you got to get all the tissues out you don't care about, right? So we can't just sort of take the scan and input it into a printer, but close to that, we threshold it. The second part that's hard is you've got to segment it, but there's now algorithms that will segment it, and segmentation means you separate all the bones. So you identify each bone, and that used to be manual, but the last couple of years there's programs that do it automatically. Then you have a bone, right? You can identify the bone you want to print, right? Or especially if you're doing the, like, let's say they're missing the talus on one side, you would be taking the CT scan from the other side and mirroring it. And in that case, you'd identify that, you'd threshold everything out, you get all the garbage out you don't want, all the tissue and all that. You'd identify the talus. The problem with printing the exact talus is it contains features you don't like. So we do have to sort of take some of those out. Like it might have bone spurs on it. Like we don't want to reprint, like if the person has a bone spur, we're going to take that out, right? So, and so we have engineers that actually come in and help remove parts and sort of help it, make it look a little bit, it looks like the native talus, but there's some small differences. But once we've been through that, then that STL file goes directly to the printer and we print it. So there is a couple steps before. It's not quite plug and play. We're trying to get the steps before more automated. So we can do that process in a couple days. We'd prefer it to be much more automated. where all those thresholding comes automatic. And we've also noticed that the engineers tend to remove the same features. So we're trying to build some algorithms that might teach us to do that. So the implant design is, the STL for the implant's a little more automatic. But it is really cool. We don't have to, it's not like starting from scratch, right? You're not just drawing the talus by hand. We are starting from the CT scan. So that in that sense, it is a print of that anatomy.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how do the implants react when people gain weight or lose weight, or young people grow? How often do they have to be replaced for account for changes in the patient's body?
Yeah, we've not done any patients under, I think we did one patient that was 17. That was our extreme end of our age category. We prefer to be a little 18 plus usually. Sometimes children have to have implants. You don't have a choice in that case. And we try to design them in a way that can be taken out easily or removed or done. But right now, very few implants can adjust with the growth of very young patients. It's a big problem in scoliosis stuff. There's a couple of rods made by NuVasive that can change length a little bit, but that's an issue. If the patient has a massive weight gain, you'll see this problem in hernia meshes and stuff. So if you have a hernia mesh in, and well, an extreme would be like you became pregnant, and it stretches the mesh. The materials don't respond well is the short answer. It's not a good setup, right? So if it's put in a certain size and everything changes, that usually have to replace. The goal with any surgery, if you have to have a surgery every year, you're not going to want to have the surgery, right? I mean, that's just extreme. The gold standard is kind of, can you make these things last 20 years? They're not going to last forever because it's really tough to be able to do that, and things change and the body change. And so there are implants that last longer than that, but you want a lot of implants, the ones we've been doing some of them are 4 years out, some are 7 years out. So, we're getting close to the 10-year mark, which I consider a pretty strong time to last. So you would not want to be having surgeries every 10 years, but you would tolerate that over amputation, for example.
I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions. Who are the leading biomaterial printing companies, and does Duke have one vendor that they generally use that's local to Durham?
Yeah, so, well, yeah, this is just in full disclosure, I have a massive conflict here. So we print biomaterial. We do this, right? My startup that I'm a part owner of, Restore 3D, and Duke does not have we do print implants for Duke. I have a conflict of interest there, so I don't really get involved in that part of it. But they have other vendors that 3D print as well. So we have a couple competitors that also do it. There's one called Additive Orthopedics that was also printing for Duke. I think they were just purchased by Paragon 28. There's also some newer ones coming out that are printing parts. There's like NuVasive, a lot of the big companies print spinal cages. So a whole bunch of different companies. And we're our business, Restore 3D is one of those.
Okay. Has any research been done to use bioprinted material for cartilage replacement?
A little bit. I have some work in this area. Cartilage is such a tough material to replicate and to do that. The printing of it is really tough. It adds another dimension that makes it really hard to do. So we have not been printing we've been working on a cartilage replacement company that's doing this cartilage replacement. It will go into clinical trials in a couple months or in a couple of years. That is not printed. Right now, we don't need the printing for that because we don't need the structure. It's more about making something really, really tough. So there are some people 3D printing biotissues. So if you search 3D printing biological tissues, there's a lot of research there. That research is really far out from commercialization, in my opinion. It's hard right now to print with the resolution to reproduce tissues, especially functional tissues like kidney or liver, anything like that.
Okay. All right, one last question. Are you doing work or teaming on microplastics particles in vivo?
I think if I understand that, we do look at that a little bit. So there are some standards we test to understand if there's going to be plastic. We don't have any we don't have any plastic implants right now, so we don't do as much of that, but that is something we think about, as far as how might microplastics impact being in the body if you have an implant. With an instrument, you're in there quick and out, so we don't do too much of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all of this and for your time today. Your presentation was wonderful. We appreciate you being here. Any last words or comments?
No, well, just thank you for having me. Hopefully it was interesting for everyone to just see a little different area and some of the engineering behind it. So I appreciate everyone being here.
All right, thank you so much. Everyone on the call today, you'll receive your PDH form via email. Just a few save the date items. We have our Raleigh seminar is December 6th through 8th. Details on that will be coming out soon. Our next webinar is October 27th. We have NCDOT Hydraulics Unit presenting for that. Ken, thank you again so much. Everyone have a wonderful day.
All right, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.